Welcome. I'm Sarah Leitner. I'm on the FURL work group, and I have to make our usual standard wonderful announcement. We'd love to have anybody that has a special interest or an area of expertise or something they want to share with the rest of the community or knows somebody that does, then we would love to have you get in touch with somebody on the board, and they would work with you and how to set it up and what to do. So that's my plea, and then I will turn it over to the distinguished author, published distinguished author and poet, Walt, for his entertaining hour. Stimulating, entertaining hour. Walt, we're really sure. Enjoy.
Thank you, Sarah. Thank you, Brian. Well, we're going to play bingo. You probably thought that we were going to do something else, but the room's set up for bingo, so we might as well do that, right? That didn't go over very well. It's not Thursday, I guess. Well, anyway, good afternoon and welcome to Right Here, Right Now. You can silence your cell phones, if you would, please. And those of you watching by 1390 or on a video, you don't have to silence your cell phones. But really, it's a privilege for me to be able to share a few things with you, and I want to thank you for being willing to spend these 3 sessions with me. Each one's going to last about an hour, and I'll do my best to make them worth your time. So let's get started. My name is Walt, and I'm an author. Now, you're supposed to say, "Hi, Walt," as if this were a 12-step program or something like that, okay? Now, sometimes I can actually hardly believe that I'm saying that I'm an author, but it's true, and I even have my official author photograph to go with it. Now, that's really my first quick tip of the day, if you will. Being a writer or a poet or any kind of an artist really is a lot like being an actor. And what that means is you should say it and be it. Or if you say it, you are it. And I found a lot of creative people who are really timid and shy about their creativity. They really are uncomfortable letting the world see their work, and it's especially if they're new at it, and I can understand that. I guess I was there sometime myself before, but there's really no need to be shy or falsely modest about it. You put it on like a costume, and you just assume the role. So I can stand up here and say, I'm a writer. And of course, if you are a writer or a poet or an artist, you actually have to write something or draw something or paint something. And I have written a few books, and these are 4 of them. They actually do exist. They're over here on the table. One of them is a collection of short stories, articles, poems, and songs. All 3 of them are full of satire and humor. The 4th book is a book on organizational leadership based on an important passage in the Bible. And I'm going to talk a little bit about each of these as we go along. And like I said, I think we'll have some fun. When Sarah and the FURL people asked me if I would share some of my experiences and things I've learned as an author, I asked them if I should pitch it to people who are already writers, people who want to write, people who just want to hear a little about the experiences and the process of writing. And they said yes. So let's find out who's here today. How many of you are not writers but think you might want to try writing? All right, a couple of those. How many of you used to write but you haven't done much of it in a while and you think you might want to start again? Okay. How many of you are actually writing these days? You're a writer. Great. It doesn't, and I'll just go on. It doesn't have to be a novel. It doesn't have to be some big thing. It could, or some big nonfiction book. It could be newspaper articles or poetry or whatever. So, any more fit in that category? Just Caroline. Okay. How many are simply interested in hearing about the experiences of one writer? Oh, okay. Thank you. How many of you thought you were signing up for a macrame class? Or a 12-step macrame class? Well, anyway, we have a good mix of each of those things, and some of you are probably being modest, and I know some of you have more experience than others, and that's just going to add richness to the class when we get to the exercises. So what I want to do in these 3 sessions really is just to stir up the fire that's within you somewhere to write. And this is not exactly a writing course in any formal sense. I don't propose to teach you everything about writing. I don't know everything about writing, but I will share some quick tips and other things I've learned, and we will have some homework exercises, but they're optional. I think you'll enjoy them though. But mainly, I just want to get you excited about going home and writing and doing it for the fun of it, because you love it. And at this point, I don't think any of us is expecting to make a lot of money from writing, although it is nice to get those little royalty checks once in a while. But it's more about fun and self-expression, I think, at this point in our lives, and maybe leaving something for the grandkids to read, or maybe all that's about self-fulfillment, whatever. So I said we're going to have 3 sessions. Session 1 is my story. I'm going to introduce some practical tips about how to get started if you need those, and then set you up for the homework exercise. If we have time, we'll do a little Q&A at the end of that too. Session 2 next week, we're going to go a lot deeper into some practical teaching about writing, what I call nuts and bolts, and then some more Q&A. And then session 3, we get to read some of the exercises that you've written. And I'll be asking you to do that, maybe not all of you, but, and then we'll review some of the main points. So, are you ready to get started? All right, saying finally he's going to start. So the second quick tip is to believe that you are creative, if you have any doubts about it. Now, I'm guessing this group, most of us believe in God, right? We know that God's a creative person, right? I mean, after all, whoops. Yeah, after all, He created the universe. He created people who don't know how to do the slides. He created you and me, right? So what could be more creative than that? And we're created in His image. So that must mean you're a creative person. You don't have to pretend. It's the truth. So just in case you weren't sure, that you can be sure that you have the God-given ability to create. Now, what do you use to create? Your imagination. Exactly. You have an imagination. What do you like to create? Here we're talking about writing, but it could be cooking, painting, building birdhouses. If so, you're probably already doing those things. And if writing is the way He's wired you to express that creativity, then write. But, you say, isn't it a bit late in life to seriously think about being a writer? Well, there's several answers to that. First of all, you're still alive. You probably have more time for it now than you ever did before. Although Carol and I keep saying to each other, we're busier now that we live here than we've ever been in our lives, it seems. But if you want to make time for it, it's there. You're flexible. And you have more life experiences to draw on, right? And you've probably been a writer all your life. Now let's talk about that first point right now. The excuse that you're too old to get started. Look at these people. Mark Twain started at age 41. James Michener wrote 40 books after the age of 40. I don't know when he quit. Laura Ingalls Wilder, the Little House books, she wrote those in her 60s. Raymond Chandler, the detective novel guy, wrote his first one at 51. Wallace Stevens, a poet, mostly wrote his stuff after age 50, and he got a Pulitzer at age 75. Millard Kaufman, who came up with the idea for Mr. Magoo, but he wrote a novel at 90. Harriet Dewar, who wrote a very famous novel called Stones for Ibarra, I guess, but she was 74 when she did that. Anna Sewell, who wrote Black Beauty, we've all read that as children, at 57. And yours truly wrote his first book at 72. So, by the way, although some of the material I'm going to talk about will be in a handout I'll pass out a little bit later, feel free to take notes if you want, and also take pictures of the screen. They should be fairly easy to take with your phone. Now let's go back to that fourth point. You've been a writer all your life. But Walt, I've never written anything except my grocery list. Well, let's put things in perspective. Think about the everyday or almost everyday things most of us have written. You wrote essays and reports in school, right? Maybe articles in the school paper, letters, inscriptions and sentiments on greeting cards, memos, reports at work, presentations. Maybe you wrote little notes to put in your kids' lunch boxes. notes to the teacher, requests for maintenance to come to your house here to fix something. You write checks, presumably those are nonfiction, and so on. So the third quick tip is you're already a writer. And some of you already consider yourselves writers, or you wouldn't have raised your hands at various points. But if not, if you still have any doubts, you are a writer. Say, well, what about fiction writing? Maybe you had to write a short story in school. If not, your first foray into the world of fiction may have been the essay you had to submit with your college education, your application. Like, you know, tell us about yourself, Kathy. No fiction there, right? Maybe you've been writing and posting stuff on social media, so don't believe you're not already writing. You've been doing it all your life. So would everybody agree with that pretty much? Okay. My story is I've been writing since I was a little boy, and I didn't get serious about creative writing until late in life, after I retired, because I didn't think I'd have time for it, and maybe that sounds like some of you as well. But I wrote my first short story at age 8. It was a nail-biting detective thriller called The Case of the Muddy Shoes. It was only 59 words, but it was a start. And here's a picture of the author as a young man. That's not really me, but I just thought the picture was too funny when I found it. And when I was writing that story, I was probably imitating something I'd heard on the radio, because that's what kids do, or that's what we did back then before TV. I also had an ear for satire and parody before I really even knew what they were. At age 11, I was writing fake radio commercials for Mother Murphy's Moldy Meatballs. And that's hilarious stuff when you're 11. So I love puns and other plays on words and idioms gone awry. Love that stuff. So writing was not something I put on my bucket list, certainly not at age 8. I don't think in terms of bucket lists anyway. But I'm spending a little time on my story because you might see yourself in some of it, and then we'll get into some practical stuff you can walk away with. So let me set the stage. First, some authors' comments about writing. Ernest Hemingway says there's nothing to it. All you do is sit down at a typewriter and bleed. Sylvia Plath says the worst enemy to creativity is self-doubt. The scariest moment is always just before you start. Stephen King, who writes scary stuff. First and foremost, writing reminds us that we're alive and that it is a gift and a privilege, not a right. Ray Bradbury, famous science fiction writer. The mind has plenty of ways of preventing you from writing, and paralyzing self-consciousness is a good one. The only thing to do is ignore it. And remember what Vincent van Gogh said about the painter's fear of the blank canvas. The canvas, he said, is far more afraid of the painter. Think about that. And then Douglas Adams wrote, I love deadlines. I love the whooshing noise they make as they go by. Anybody ever, you know who Douglas Adams is? The Hitchhiker's Guide to the Universe. He's written a bunch of books like that. Now, I do remember my parents, especially my mother, being very supportive. We often played a card game called Authors. Anybody remember this game? It featured all the well-known old authors like Mark Twain, Charles Dickens, William Shakespeare, Louisa May Alcott, Edgar Allan Poe, and so on. So I knew about these people at a very young age, and some of what they wrote, even though I hadn't read any of it yet. But it made me curious about them and about writing. And it elevated the importance of reading and writing in my eyes. And believe it or not, it helps me occasionally when I'm watching Jeopardy. And if that game is still around, and I think it is, and if you have young grandchildren or great-grandchildren, you can tell your parents, their parents about it, just in case they don't know, because I would really recommend giving it as a gift. In grade school, they made us take one of those personality profile tests, and mine said I should be a performing musician. But all I could picture was me on a stage playing the violin, and I couldn't believe I'd ever do that. I think it just meant I had an aptitude to do creative things in public, not necessarily music, although I've done some of that. But in my case, I was wired to be a writer. And you're probably wired that way yourself, or you wouldn't be here, as we had the hand raising before. But our society and our culture devalues that. It hates us. It tries to rob us of the joy of it. And that happens to all of us. And that's why Carol and I are so happy that our children have bent over backwards to encourage our grandchildren's creativity. One of our oldest grandchild, in fact, just came out with a, what do they call it? Not a comic, a graphic novel. And it's pretty good. I haven't actually read it, but we've seen some of the illustrations from it, and they're wonderful. So he's a writer and an illustrator. And when he was a kid, he knew more about dinosaurs than the teacher did, and he drew them. And they just really encouraged that. So we want to kind of come against society's attempt to rob us of the joy of writing and being creative. So harking back to the case of the muddy shoes, it's a little ironic that here some 70 years later, one of my novels is about a detective. And I guess what goes around comes around, as they say. This is the Accidental Spurt. It's the newest novel that's out now, and I just want to read what it says on the back cover. Downsized out of work, Mark Fairley lands a temporary consulting gig writing the history of troubled energy drink company Spur Nutritionals while he looks for a real job, only to find himself investigating the company president's death in a suspicious explosion and the chairman's odd behavior after a freak accident on the bottling line as shadowy international forces vying for control of the multi-billion-dollar energy drink industry vow to stop at nothing to keep the game-changing truth hidden. Can Mark solve the treacherous maze of homicide, inept corporate espionage, dysfunctional family intrigue, and hilarious intercultural missteps without becoming the next unexplained casualty? And will he ever get a real job? Now, no doubt you wrote things when you were a boy or girl too. Growing up, I wrote the same things we all wrote in school, but I couldn't help going a little further. In high school, these are not any of my friends, but it's a great picture I found. Some friends and I, we'd improvise skits on a tape recorder in my basement. We did parody and satires, doing poor imitations of Bob and Ray, and Stan Freberg, and Walter Cronkite, and Mike Wallace, and so on. I still have the tapes 70 years later. They still play. I guess we were nerds before our time. I also read tons and tons of science fiction as a teenager, so I unconsciously learned from that how to structure a short story. And of course, Mad Magazine for the satire. This actually may be the world's first selfie. So here's quick tip number 4, read a lot. Moving on to college, a friend and I produced a program on the campus radio station. It was a spur-of-the-moment satirical skits, and we played offbeat music. It was called To Be Announced, because we had no idea from one week to the next what we were going to do, and it was kind of cheeky. Again, I have all the scripts and tapes from that too. I think we had 3 or 4 listeners. And then, given all that, you might ask, why didn't you pursue writing as a career? Well, there were no writers in my family, so I had no role models for it. My dad was an administrator for various government agencies in Washington. He had a parallel career in the Army Reserve. My mom was a homemaker, raising me and my sister, and her creative activity was gardening. They both had a strong work ethic because they grew up in the Depression and went through World War II, and I picked up on that. But I had the sense to figure I probably couldn't make a living as a writer anyway. Relatively few people do. And success there, turns out, has a lot more to do with connections and luck than skill. And that's true of most of the arts, I think. You can be really good, but there's always somebody better or better connected. And where I am, I'd just rather have my stuff read and hopefully appreciated by as many people as possible, because I like entertaining and making people laugh. And I like the compliments, and who doesn't like that? So I went the business route instead, majoring in economics instead of English and going on to get an MBA. But I always kept the writing dream alive. Occasionally I'd send something off to a magazine. I think maybe I only had one or two things published in all the time I was working, but those were very satisfying. And I had the good fortune to get into a very creative business too. It was a new venture, and I like those. I found my way to Haynes Corporation in Winston-Salem just in time to work on Legs, the pantyhose in the plastic eggs. Remember those? I didn't create them, but because I always say I arrived on day 2, not day 1. But it did help create and execute the marketing plan and the advertising and help manage the test markets and the national rollout, and I loved it. It was really fun. But there was a lot of writing involved. And it turns out, when you think about it, business writing is creative. You're writing letters, memos, and presentations, in my case, some advertising too. You're trying to be very clear, concise, and above all, persuasive without actually lying. And that takes creativity. How many of you can relate to that experience? Business. Well, even during that time, though, I couldn't resist writing the fake joke memo and other stuff to entertain and confound my colleagues. And I barely kept out of trouble until I was more senior and could more safely get away with it. And for example, there was a year we had a nylon crop failure. Had to make a big announcement about that. Which brings us to quick tip number 5, don't take yourself too seriously. In fact, that's what it says on the cover of the first book that was accepted by a traditional publisher, which I called On Shallowed Ground. Dr. Barker's scientific metamorphical prostate health formula and other stories, poems, comedy, and dark matter from the center of the universe. And notice the 11th commandment. Can you read the 11th commandment? Thou shalt not take thyself too seriously. In a few minutes, I'll talk a little bit more about how this book came to be published. But again, I'm telling you all this personal history stuff, not because I'm so wonderful, but because you might see parallels in your own experience. Maybe you didn't do as much creative writing as I did, but you may have done a lot more than you think, so be encouraged. Now, 2 questions I want to cover now. First, where was the breakthrough that got me writing seriously at last? And second, how did I finally get published? And actually, it was a series of breakthroughs and milestones. In the early 2000s, I was basically retired, but still active on a couple of nonprofit boards and fooling around with doing some consulting. And it's that time of some of our lives when we start asking, okay, what's next? What am I supposed to do with myself now? And of course, Carol and I were praying about this, as we've always done when we face change and transition in our life. And questions like, should I continue to work? Should I do more volunteer work, or just plain have some creative fun? We were at a church conference about that time, and I got a piece of godly advice from some of the visiting speakers. I'd really been suppressing the urge to spend more time writing because I had this mindset that said, this is not important. It's not worthy of spending time on at the expense of more important work, whatever that might be. But I began to understand that actually I was free to do anything I wanted. I could take the idea of writing a book out of the cupboard, where I'd hidden it away as being an unworthy pursuit, and I could play with it. Now, this didn't happen overnight. There was a process involved that actually took a few years, but slowly I did begin to do some more writing for fun. The pile of rejection notices grew, but I kept on, and there were a few more victories. So is it maybe time for you to take writing out of the cupboard yourself? And if you are wondering about that, I hereby give you permission to do so. Now, I did attend a couple of writing classes in Greensboro. I joined a local writers group and the North Carolina Writers Network, and I started hanging out with other writers at various events. Even co-founded a small group of other writers where we could critique each other's work and help one another. And while I was helping them, they were encouraging me with some of the stories I was working on, which leads to quick tip number 6, hang out with other writers. And it's the same really for any pursuit. Get to know some people who are already doing it. Artists hang out with other artists. Musicians play with other musicians. Stan Getz, a famous saxophone player, said, play with musicians that are better than you are. And that's good advice. So in all these experiences and a lot of practice definitely made me a better writer. But it did take some time. And in the process, I plucked up the courage and gumption to get serious about writing my first book. And it wasn't what I would have expected. So I'd actually started on a novel way back in the mid-1970s, and you might think that would be the first project I went back to, but no, it was this book, The Fivefold Effect. It's a book on leadership from a biblical perspective. I know there are tons of such books, but this one was unique and at the time because its thesis is that the fivefold gifts of Ephesians 4:11 through 16, which if you remember is apostle, prophet, pastor, teacher, and evangelist, are operating in the marketplace, not just in church. It's really a guidebook for how these gifts work together and how to identify your own spiritual gifts and how to use that understanding in the practice of your own life and business or ministry. For a lot of people at the time, it was a radical idea that these gifts were for the marketplace, not just the church. I first got the idea for this in 2003. I was on the board of trustees at Regent University and then good friends with the dean of the School of Business. And I tried to get the school interested in doing a research project to test the thesis, but turns out that would have been impossible or impractical. So then I thought, well, why don't one of you professors take on the project, write a book about it? They liked the idea, but nobody wanted to take on the project, and I kept trying and trying and trying, and this went on for about 8 years, and finally Carol said, well, I think you are supposed to write this book. So with her encouragement, and that of others from Regent and the church we attend in High Point, I did. What about you? Do you have an unwritten book inside you? Maybe. You have a story to tell? A life experience that you want to share, or a great idea based on something you've read or seen, or something you've imagined? Okay, so now I've written this book. How do I get it published? Do I try to find a traditional publisher, or do I self-publish? These are the main differences between traditional publishers and self-publishing houses. Sometimes these days the self-publishing houses are called indie publishers. The traditional publishers will distribute your book to bookstores as well as online, like through Amazon, but self-publishing houses generally won't get you into bookstores. They will put you up on Amazon and so forth. For self-publishing, you pay the publisher up front to publish your book and provide various levels of service. They offer different packages, and you pay whatever it is for the package. Traditional publishers don't ask you to pay them, and some might even give you an advance payment against future royalties. But the royalty percentages are higher when you self-publish. Now these days, very few traditional publishers will even look at a manuscript unless it comes from a literary agent. So many people are writing books that the volume of submissions is just staggering. Now both of these approaches are legitimate and popular, and self-publishing is becoming even more popular because it's so easy now to create your own online content. Every thing on the computer, you can do it. Now my book, the one I held up before, is actually endorsed by some pretty well-known people in the church world, and the foreword is written by a well-known and highly respected author and speaker, a guy named Dr. Mark Verkler. So I thought, well, this will be easy to get published by one of the leading traditional Christian book publishers, like Destiny Image or Chosen or Thomas Nelson or Revell. You may have heard of some of those. But sadly, no, I tried. Some of the people who endorsed the book are authors themselves, and they tried on my behalf, but no dice. And there were two basic problems. And I learned these from some of the publishers who would talk to me. First of all, I have no platform. I'm not a well-known author or church leader. I don't have a big congregation. I'm not a speaker at large conferences where thousands of people would be exposed to the book. And second, it didn't fit into an obvious genre. Is it inspirational? Is it self-help? Is it devotional, prayer, emotional healing, spiritual growth? Well, maybe, but not exactly. One publisher actually told me, we really like the book, but we don't know how to catalog it. Pigeonholes are alive and well in the publishing business. And it is a business, so unless you have a platform, you're subject to the way they want to do things. That was pretty discouraging. And it was a fruitless effort, really, that took about a year before I realized I had to self-publish. Now, there's thousands of publishers who'll publish your book, self-publishers, if you pay them. They're hungry for your business. You see commercials for them all the time, probably. They'll provide editing services, they'll design the cover, they'll take care of copyrights, the International Standard Book Number, barcodes, all that stuff, and they'll put it up on Amazon and other online bookseller platforms for you. And I imagine most do a good job. Some of them might even help you with marketing the book, which is advertising and publicity, but all at a cost. You'll pay for whatever the package is. I looked at several and finally chose Westbow, which is a division of Thomas Nelson. So they had a package I liked, the price was acceptable, and I figured if they're one of the leading publishers of Bibles and Christian books, they'd be honest and dependable, and they were. So they did a great job of publishing the book. And the book actually won an award, the Eric Hoffer First Horizon Award finalist for excellence in independent publishing. So it didn't win, but it was a finalist. Anyhow, all that process, including writing the book and getting feedback from people I call first readers, which I'll talk about more in a minute, and getting the endorsements, searching for a publisher and so forth, finally getting it published took about 2 years. It has been well received. I've had some success marketing it through various contacts that I have, and I've taught on it in person a few times. So traditional or self-publish, if you have a book, you're going to face the same question, whether it's nonfiction like that one or fiction like my others. So how did I finally get published by a traditional publisher? And the answer there is all about relationships. I did mention I joined the Locals Writers Group and took a couple of writing classes. And as an exercise for one of those classes, I wrote a short science fiction story that the teacher seemed to like. He thought it had some promise. He coached me on how to make it even better. And through my membership in the North Carolina Writers Network, I learned that a publisher called Fantastic Books Publishing in England was calling for story submissions for an anthology they were putting together. So I polished up my story and submitted it, and lo and behold, they accepted it. The story is called The Meeting at the Center of the Universe, and here's what it looks like in the anthology that they published. And this was the breakthrough. The upshot is that this began a relationship between me and Fantastic Books Publishing, whose owner and CEO is a guy named Dan Grubb. He liked my work, and so I figured he was open to receiving even more of it. Well, I was emboldened by that, and I wondered if it would be fun to pull together a bunch of my short stories and poems and other miscellaneous funny stuff I'd written over the years and make it into a collection that could be published as a book. So over the course of several months, I did that. I called it On Shallowed Ground, which is this book, the one I showed you a few minutes ago with the picture of Moses on it. And you might ask, well, why not just send this book to Fantastic Books? Well, it's because I still hoped that I could sell it to a bigger traditional publisher. It took me a year to learn that there's two major problems with trying to find a traditional publisher for fiction if you have no platform and no connections in the publishing world, and I didn't except for Fantastic Books. The first is that, as I already said, because there's an unbelievable amount of competition out there, with hundreds of people writing books, almost no publishers will look at unsolicited manuscripts. You have to have an agent. The second is that agents, by and large, are looking for young writers they can grow with. So when you send your query letter to a prospective agent, of course you don't have to tell them how old you are, but they can immediately look you up on social media and boom, you're busted. When I tried to pitch on Shallowed Ground, I was already 73 years old, and as far as any agents were concerned, I already had one foot in the grave. Never mind if my work is any good. All told, for that book and the other three fiction books, I wrote to 19 publishers and 141 agents and got no takers. Now that may sound like the definition of insanity right there, but I didn't know any better then. Does that mean my books are really no good? Yes, so let's go home. No. Did it mean I wrote lousy query letters? No. It's the competition and my age. But don't let that stop you. I confess there were days when I sat around feeling sorry for myself, then I realized nobody was going to come to my pity party, And I got over it because I'm compelled to keep writing. Now, this saga might sound a little negative and discouraging, but my point is, don't give up on finding that breakthrough. Write what's on your heart, and who knows, keep at it. And actually, there are ways of making contact in the publishing field if you want to make the effort. And it can be fun. One is to enroll in a writing class at one of the universities, and there's tons of those around here. Then network with the professors, see what kind of contacts you can make. Many colleges and universities are offering what's called an MFA degree, Master in Fine Arts, if you want to go all the way. Another idea is to attend writers' conferences, workshops, and camps, and those can be fun. You go, you establish a presence there, you meet agents and publishers who come to these things looking for good work, and you can make pitches to them while you're there. And you can find out about some of the conferences and so forth through some of the resources I'll talk about in the next session. Now, of course, I didn't do any of those things except for the associations I developed by joining the local writers group, which ultimately did lead to that first breakthrough. So I finally, after all that, sent On Shallowed Ground to Dan Grubb at Fantastic Books, where I already had that connection and that relationship, and he liked it. And he's published my 2 novels as well, and before you ask, at my age, have I finished writing? I'll just say he will be publishing my 3rd novel later this year. And for that one, I didn't waste time looking for agents. Now let me talk a little bit about the publishing process. Fantastic, oops. Oh yes, I should have had that slide up when I was talking about all the rejections I was getting. Anyway, now, Fantastic Books logo. The Fantastic Books Publishing is a small family-owned publishing company in Hull, England, and I like their motto, just imagine. In some ways, these folks are sort of a combination or a cross between traditional and self-publishing. I didn't pay anything up front, and after book sales cover the production expenses, the proceeds are split 45% going to me as a royalty, 45% going to them, and the other 10% going to a charity. He produces the books in ebook form for Kindle, Nook, iPad, or whatever, and the print version is paperback, and it's a print-on-demand arrangement. That means if you order from Amazon.com or somewhere else, they'll print up a copy and send it out. There's no inventory to speak of, no automatic distribution to bookstores. So if my books were to sell in thousands, this publisher would probably create some inventory and get bookstore distribution for me, but so far that hasn't happened. And he'll also do some marketing and promotion, but I'm responsible for doing most of that myself. It's unusual, but it does work for me. And by the way, marketing your work is beyond the scope of these sessions, so I won't be spending much time on it. I'll just say now it's labor intensive. It involves a command of social media that's way beyond me, but if you have a child or a grandchild, they're probably right into this stuff and can help you with it and maybe even do it for you. And there are tons of people out there you can pay to do this sort of stuff for you. Now, my one regret in all this has to do with that novel I mentioned I started in the 1970s. When I first started writing the novel, I'd come home from work, and after dinner I'd close myself off in the home office for hours at a time, and on weekends just writing away. It was hard on our family life. My wife, is she here? Oh yeah, that lady there. Can I see your name tag? Okay. Carol. Is it Carol? I thought so. She says we have 3 children and they turned out okay, except I hear 2 of them are lawyers, so I'm not so sure. Anyhow, the book looks pretty good. Called Everybody Shrugged. It's about environmentalism taken to a ridiculous extreme by the government, aided by academia, while the military has to come up with unusual new weapons because the conventional ones have been banned because they're hazardous to your health. Everyone in the novel, from the president on down, is a certifiable idiot. You will love it. Can I say it's prophetic? I don't know about that. By the way, all the books are in the gift shop, and there's a few of them here that my lovely assistant Carol will be happy to sell you later if you want. Now, here's a summary of what goes into getting a book ready to be published, at least in my experience. Of course, first you have to write the book. Then you recruit what I call first readers. You've got the first draft. It shapes up pretty well. You probably have some nits that have to be fixed and so forth, but don't worry about that. Find these people who are willing to read the book at this stage and give you feedback, not editing the book for you, but does the book make sense? Does it seem to meet the objectives you've set out for it? Do they like it? Do they not like it? Now, these are people who are your friends and family probably, so they're going to want to like the book. You're not going to get totally objective feedback from them. But if you ask them to please be as objective as possible and tell them you won't be offended, you'll get information that's valuable to you as you go through and start the editing process on your own. So once you've done that, then you start the tweaking. You're looking for punctuation, spelling, minimizing adverbs, all the stuff you have to do to make the thing flow right from an English grammar standpoint. You submit a proposal to the publisher, and then if the proposal is accepted, you work with the publisher. First of all, in the case of fantastic books, they'll have a reader read the book and decide if they want to recommend it for publication. If they do, they'll give you some feedback about it, maybe just 2 or 3 things that they thought were good about it and a few things they thought you might want to look at and maybe change, but they're not doing intense editorial work for you. But you can still make changes based on their comments. Then there's a contract that has to be signed. Then you submit the revised manuscript. And then at this point, they do what's called copy editing. I didn't use that word here, but it's detailed editorial comments and suggestions that they will give you feedback on. Also, you have to approve the cover design and write a blurb for the cover, like the blurb that I read for that other book. Then endorsements and acknowledgements. For most people who are well-known writers, there are plenty of people out there who will write endorsements for them. There are companies that'll write endorsements for you. I have to write my own. So if you can imagine, those endorsements, if you flip through some of these books, are fairly entertaining in their own right. And the publisher doesn't mind that I write my own endorsements, so that's a good deal. And then you write something about the author, a little bio about yourself. Then you proofread it very carefully. Now you can hire a proofreader if you want to, but for some reason I like to proofread my own stuff, and submit the final manuscript with all the bells and whistles on it. And then you pray and break out the adult beverages. Now, I want to answer some questions that authors are frequently asked, and we'll have some time for some more Q&A at the end, I hope. Here are the frequently asked author questions. Where do you get your ideas? I never know, mostly from life. Sometimes from the gyms you mine from writing exercises like that story, The Meeting at the Center of the Universe. For example, the accidental spurt. Where's the accidental spurt? This one here, the current novel that's out. I lost my job, and I had a vision of myself standing in the unemployment line and imagining what I might do till I found another job. The first thing you think about is consulting, of course. Sherlock Holmes, the consulting detective. Sometimes ideas do converge. So those were experiences that led me into the idea of having Mark Fairley, the protagonist, be the reluctant amateur detective who goes undercover in this company that's having trouble. Another example, I had a heart attack a few years ago, and for some reason I wrote a short stand-up comedy routine about it. Don't ask me why. For example, the police came when along with the ambulance, and I said, why did the police come? And they said, well, you're having cardiac arrest. They didn't use a siren on the ambulance. I thought they should have used a siren. I said, why aren't you using a siren? They said, I'm sorry, sir, Obamacare doesn't cover that. Now, the heart attack was caused by years of abusing snack foods. And how I know is they found a Frito in my aorta. But they put in a stent, you know, so the Fritos could flow more freely. So anyway, even look around you. Even while you're sitting here, you might get an idea for something. And maybe it's only one word. Write it down. I won't mind if you're writing while I'm talking. Another example, I was thinking about this class one morning, and the first few lines of a poem just kind of came to me, and I will read them to you now. I went to a seminar today to teach me how to write. The other students looked away. I must have looked a fright. I hadn't shaved, my hair was messed, my sandals scuffed and worn, but I thought that's how writers dressed, yet all I got was scorn. That's going to win the Pulitzer Prize. But the point is that it's something that struck me, and I did something with it, and you can do the same thing with something however small, and it may never see the light of day, but you've gotten some practice out of it, you've enjoyed it, you might show it to somebody, and it might lead to something bigger. And that's happened to me more than once. Is your writing autobiographical? Yes, in some ways it is. I take stuff from my own life and put it in my stories. They say write what you know. That's not bad advice. I can't say any of the characters is me, although some would argue that Mark Fairley, the protagonist, it comes close. Now, Mark gets downsized out of his middle management executive job. I have business experience in both middle management and senior management. I've got familiarity with manufacturing plants located in small towns. And I was downsized twice long before it was cool. And I've been a consultant. And all that figures in the book. For Everybody Shrugged, I've worked in government, I've worked in academia, and in the Army. So got those bases covered. Now, if you want to write about what you don't know, you can do research. I even have to do research on stuff I think I do know. But it's really easy with Google or DuckDuckGo or whatever, the search engines. You can find almost anything. Obviously, you need to use common sense, however. After all, I looked it up, and it was Abraham Lincoln who famously said, "You can't believe everything you read on the internet." What do you read? Lately, for me, mystery and crime authors like Michael Connelly, Robert Cray, Robert B. Parker, David Baldacci, Louis L'Amour, who wrote in many genres, not just Westerns, Lee Child in the Jack Reacher series, sometimes history or historical novels, occasional science fiction, the occasional Christian nonfiction book, especially if I know the author. What are you reading these days? I hope you're reading. Who are the authors or others who have influenced your writing the most? Well, besides the mystery writers, I'd list Mark Twain, Robert Benchley, James Thurber, Woody Allen, Peter Sellers, Dave Barry, Bob Elliott and Ray Goulding, famous Bob and Ray, Gilbert and Sullivan, going all the way back to that, Stan Freberg, Mad Magazine, countless science fiction authors from the 50s and 60s, Arthur Conan Doyle, Sherlock Holmes, Charles Dickens, David McCullough, and Stephen Ambrose, those are history writers. And of course, William Shakespeare, William Faulkner, Ernest Hemingway, and Dostoevsky, even though I've read very little of any of them, because every author is supposed to list those among his influences. Oh, and good old King James, widely credited with writing the Bible. So, what about you? Any authors you'd like to learn from? Finally, do you ever get writer's block? People ask me that all the time. I never can think of what to say. Now, if I've inspired you to do some writing, I want you to get ready to start. We have some exercises here that you can do at home, and then I want to talk about how to prepare yourself for the actual writing process. If someone would help me pass these out. What you're going to find on here is a choice of exercises to do over the next 2 weeks, because we got 2 more sessions. Do as many as you like, and as I say, it's totally optional. But I would, you know, there's no grade, you don't fail the class, but I really would love it if you do at least one. And get it to me by Friday of next week. I mean, the week after next. No, next week. Friday of next week, the April 15th. So I can look them over before the third session and have a chance to maybe select a few of them. We'll be reading them in session 3, maybe not all of them, but some of them, and I might be asking you to be up here reading your own. In fact, I would prefer that. And I'm not going to be picking them because some are better than others. It's probably because there's something in them that I want to bring out or talk about in particular, some particular style or idea or whatever, some point I want to illustrate. So this is not a contest. You know, what you write is what you write, and it's nobody else's. So I'm giving the exercises out now, so you'll have a couple of weeks to think about them and decide what you want to write. And also, so you'll have the benefit of next week's session where I really get into some nuts and bolts about writing before you have to turn them in. The only other guideline, I think it's mentioned on there, is ideally I'd like to have your submissions be original work that you did for the class and not something you've already written, but that's not a hard and fast rule. Those of you who are watching on 1390, you're invited to participate too, and if you want a copy of the exercises, just email me and I'll email them to you. My email is addressed in the directory on Care Merge, of course. Here are the exercises. The first one is choose from one or more from the list of exercises. The first one is write a paragraph or two, 400-word max, or a poem or any length, inspired by one of these two pictures. For picture B, do not start with, "It was a dark and stormy night." Now, the pictures are on the handout, but if you want to take a picture of the screen, you can do that too. The second option is write a paragraph or a page or as much as you want about one of these topics. A childhood experience that taught you a lesson or inspired you, made you feel good, or you wish you could go back and do over. A life mulligan, if you will. Or a remarkable moment, positive, negative, or neutral, in your career, on a trip, or in your family. Write a description of a room, your living room, an office, a restaurant, or whatever. It could be an actual room or a fictitious one. Fourth option, write 2 double-spaced pages of dialogue of an imaginary or a real conversation. Don't worry about punctuation. Punctuation in dialogue can be a bear. Just forget, don't worry about it. Just write the dialogue. Or, number 5, write a poem or a short story on one or both of these 2 themes, a happy place and emerging. Those are the prompts. You might think of them either literally or metaphorically. When you've done this, put your work in my box in the mailroom. It's 5370 Geneva Terrace. I think all this information is on there. And I did say this wasn't a contest, but there actually is a writing contest sponsored by FURL that begins on May 1st. So I'm giving you some advance warning about that. In fact, I think there was a brief announcement in Compass about that. And in session 3, I'll have some advanced copies of the guidelines for you. I'm not sure when those are going to be published exactly. So now, please put the handout aside for a moment. You'll see there's some stuff on the back, because I want your full attention on this next part, which is about preparing to write. Okay? Now, I want to start with this idea. Don't get it right, just get it written. It's been attributed to James Thurber, I think maybe some other people too, but we'll go with him. This is probably the best writing advice I ever got. Don't get it right, get it written. Don't sweat the details. Don't worry about punctuation, spelling, grammar, all that stuff. If you edit as you go along, your progress will be slow. You'll never get going. Momentum is worth its weight in gold, somebody said. And remember, once you write it, you can always go back and fix it, but you can't fix it if you don't write it. And I'm going to be harping on this. Okay, let's talk about working conditions for the writer. Now, my workspace is in one of our guest bedrooms that I've turned into an office. Thomas Wolfe, who wrote Look Homeward, Angel, and You Can't Go Home Again, among other stuff, was 6'6" and wrote all his novels in longhand with a pencil, and according to legend, sometimes did it standing up using the top of his refrigerator for a desk. And I'm only 5'10", and my handwriting is so bad I've often been mistaken for a doctor. So sit and use a word processor if you want to. That's what I do. But you have to be very careful about spell check. Sometimes it'll correct stuff that's not what you meant, and if you don't go back and look at it after you've written it now, don't worry about it at the time, unless you just happen to glance at it and see it's the wrong word. Okay, now a lot of you probably have already carved out office space like mine. Carol and I have the luxury of 2 guest bedrooms, so I have one as an office and she can have the other for her computer and art studio space. And there's actually a bed in there for when we might actually have a guest. Now, whether you have your own space or share a space, the important thing is that you have a place you can go that's quiet, private, at least at certain times when you're working or writing, and comfortable, and with few distractions. Being able to find a quiet place and get quiet while you're writing is pretty important. So that's quick tip number 7, find a quiet place. Okay? I think these tips are on the back of that handout, but all right, now preparing to write. Keeping always in mind about finding a quiet place, here's some thoughts about how to prepare to write or do the exercises that you've chosen. You can call this the 11-step program if you want. They are on the back of your exercise sheet. Again, find a quiet, private place to sit or stand if you want to use your fridge. Minimize distractions. That's no TV, no radio, no social media, no barking dogs, etc. If you like to have some music on or some soothing white noise, that's fine. If it turns out that you are one of those people who likes to have noise in the background, I'm not telling you not to do it. But if you're not, and you're just kind of looking for the best way to do it, don't start with noise. Start with quiet. If you're intimidated by looking at a blank page or a blank screen, and many people are, I have nothing to write, I can't think of anything. But you know you've got something in your mind you want to talk about. Dictate it. Just dictate it into your phone. You can always transcribe it later. And I tell this to all my friends, and many of them have said, I did that and it worked. Now, and again, remember the cardinal rule, don't get it right, get it written. Now, quiet, so you're in this space, it's quiet, no distractions. You got to quiet yourself down. Really, quiet yourself down. And then wait. Still quiet. If you don't already have an idea what to write, start writing whatever pops into your head. Maybe it's just the word blank. Fine. Write it and go from there. Or a name. Brenda, Margaret, Charlie. Maybe you're tired. Write tired. Go back to the exercises and use one of them as a prompt. It doesn't matter. Just the point is to do something that gets you started. Use your imagination, but don't overthink it. Sometimes thought is the enemy of flow. All right, once you're going, keep going. Let it flow. Now, you've written something, right? After you write it, let it sit for a while. Then come back to it, looking at it with fresh eyes. Now is the time for revising and editing, not while you're writing it. Next one, let somebody else read it and comment. This is akin to the first writer concept, but for first reader concept, but first readers are usually for novels or longer works. But if it's a short story or just a poem or something like that that you're writing, just find somebody else to read it and get their comments, get their reaction, and then revise some more if you want to. Then let it sit some more, and then finish it. Okay? That's about it for today. I see it's exactly 4 o'clock. I hope I've managed to stir up your interest in writing, and as I said, next time I'm going to have a lot more in-depth nuts and bolts kind of stuff about the writing process itself, how to write, and I think it'll be more practical and helpful than the first part of this was for you. But I think we do have some time for some Q&A if there is, and I'm willing to stay here as long as anybody wants to ask questions. Anybody have any questions? Okay. Thank you all for coming. I hope to see all of you next week.